Hello, this is Chapter 9, Unwelcomed. At first, Julian had eagerly scanned every car that pulled into the parking lot, but after nearly an hour, he gave up. His solution, he figured, was fairly dire. According to the Greyhound schedule posted on the kiosk, there would be no bus returning to San Francisco until the next morning. And even if he somehow survived the night in Wiltis, a daunting prospect, and was able to make it back to San Francisco, where would he go? He could hardly return to his uncle's, and math camp was no longer an option. A white truck pulled to a stop in front of him. Julian glanced wearily up and saw a barefoot girl wearing cut-off blue jeans and a tie-dyed shirt climbing out of the passenger seat. "Are you Julian?" she asked. She was an inch or two taller than him, with brown braids, straight brown eyebrows, and a scattering of freckles. The image of the blonde Viking girl dissolved. Julian stood up, flooded with relief. "Are you Robin?" Her blue eyes lit up. She bent towards him and said in a husky voice, "Sorry we're late. My dad's still a little upset. I kind of forgot to tell him you were coming until today." The driver's side door opened and a man stepped out, tall with gray and brown hair cut roughly around his ears. Although he was dressed in jeans and his face was tan and weathered, there was something professional, no, pro- professorial about him. I don't know what that word is. I'm going to have to look it up. A keen, inquisitive gaze that left Julian doubting that the plan he and Robin had concocted would ever succeed. The man gave Julian a hawk like glance, then reached out and shook Julian's hand as though he were an adult. His palms felt rough and calloused. "Julian," he said, "I'm Bob Elder. I understand you and my daughter have been carrying on a little correspondence." What was Robin's father talking about? He wasn't supposed to know about the emails. That wasn't part of the plan. Robin gave Julian a nervous smile. He swallowed and said, "I guess so. You took the bus here by yourself, all the way from San Francisco?" Julian nodded and attempted to steer back to the script. "I'm here for the exchange program, the farm/urban network." "We do have exchange students," Bob said, frowning, "but there's a long process, a lot of paperwork. It has to go through the main office. Robin knows that perfectly well. I don't know what she was thinking telling you to come up here on your own." He took several sheets of folded paper out of his front shirt pocket, which Julian recognized as the forms he and Danny had filled out. "Your mom signed these?" His gray eyes seemed to stare through Julian. Right now she's actually out of the country, but she loves nature and stuff." Bob gave Robin a quick look, then turned back to Robin. "Who do you live with then?" Oops, let me get rid of something so I can read. Okay. Julian thrust his hands into his pocket. If he didn't pass inspection, he might be stuck in the parking lot for a long time. "Well, I live with my mom, but she's in China right now. She's a photographer. That's why I'm doing the exchange program, because she's not here." He waited for Robin to come to his rescue. "Dad, be nice. I told you we were pen pals through fun, and I was telling him about Huckleberry Ranch, and he was saying how much he'd like to see it. It was my idea for him to come up. The forms are all filled out perfectly, and the other stuff is just paperwork and stupid bureaucracy. Robin, I have no doubt you're responsible for this mess, but I'm afraid there's more to it than that. All I'm saying is he just spent hours on a bus. Can't we at least take him home and give him something to eat before you cross-examine him?" "You're not running away, are you?" Bob asked, still weighing Julian with his eyes. Julian was taken aback. "I'm not running away." He'd passed the lie detector on that one, he figured. It wasn't running away when nobody wanted you in the first place. "Robin wrote to me about your house in the Redwoods. She said it would be okay if I came up," he added, glancing at Robin with a hint of accusation. He hung in his pocket. Oh, he dug in his pocket. Oh my God. He dug in his pocket for his return ticket to San Francisco and handed it to Robin's father. who studied it closely and handed it back. Well, get in the truck. I'd feel more comfortable if I could talk to whoever's in charge of you. But I guess we'll have to straighten that out when we get home. Bob swung Julian's duffel bag into the back of the truck. Robin gave Julian a quick grin, then climbed into the passenger side, motioned for Julian to follow. For a while they rode in silence. Robin and her father seemed to have reached some kind of truce, but Julian felt numb. Here he was, coming to help Robin save Big Tree Grove, and her father looked at him with coldness and distrust. He had not realized how many expectations he'd had until Bob Elder crushed them. What was he expecting? Certainly not this unsmiling interrogation. He had expected to be greeted with open arms, to be welcomed into Robin's family, to be taken in. Julian gazed resentfully at Robin, who sat sucking on the tip of her braid, her hand resting on her father's neck. He'd done everything right, filling out all those tricky forms and getting away from siblings and finding his way up here. All Robin had to do was account for a few missing pieces of paperwork, but clearly she'd caved under her father's scrutiny. Not that he could entirely blame her, Julian thought, turning away from Bob's stern profile. After a few miles, the truck took a sharp turn onto a dirt road. All of a sudden, they were inside the forest, but it wasn't at all like he'd imagined from the highway. From a distance, the mountains were covered with an unending line of dark trees, cool and uneven. Here the forest was a mess. Clusters of branches and dead tree trunks lay scattered on the ground. The weeds alongside the road were covered with dust. They'd just finished a logging operation here, Robin said. Julian glanced back at a field of sun-baked stumps, littered with broken branches. The road continued down, curving along steep hillsides, then abruptly flattened out. They passed a creek, and Julian saw a cluster of houses with tricycles and trucks and old metal parts lying about. Occasionally, when they passed a house or a driveway, Robin would tell him the name of the family who lived there. The farther they went, the more she talked. Her father remained silent, but at last he kept driving on and on through the dim, dusty forest, every turn taking them further away from the bus stop. At last they came to an open gate and a sign that said Huckleberry Ranch. The dusty tunnel through the forest opened into a green valley. Steep hills rose up on either side of a narrow river. As they made a turn, Julian saw a deer and a little fawn grazing. At the sound of the truck, they lifted their heads from the grass and watched them pass. "Did you see the deer?" he asked. "A deer?" He had never in his life seen a deer in the wild, and there they had stood, a little deer family. Robin just smiled. At last the truck pulled up to a gravel driveway, and Bob turned off the engine. In the sudden quiet, Julian could hear the leaves blowing in the breeze and the high falling song of a bird. In front of them stood a wooden house with yellow flowers in the window boxes and a deck stretching along the side. Several chickens strutted in the yard, and a tire swing hung from a gnarled old tree. On the front steps, the sun shone on the bare shoulders of a little child who sat tapping a stick against the railing. "Is that your sister?" Julian asked, climbing out of the truck. Robin giggled. "Well, he's half naked. I think you could tell. Don't they teach you anything in the city?" Julian blushed. Bob grabbed the red duffel bag from the back of the truck. The little boy jumped to his feet and yelled, "Charge!" branching the stick like a miniature naked samurai. Jojo, be nice, Robin said. This is my friend Julian, and put your clothes on, you little savage. She picked a pair of tan shorts off the deck and forced one of his legs and then the other through the openings. Even as he lifted his feet, Jojo continued to stare at Julian and block his way with the stick. You'll have to excuse him, Robin explained. He watched he watched King Arthur at my cousin's house last month, and he still hasn't recovered. The door opened and a woman came out of the house. She wiped her hands on her apron, then pushed wisps of brown hair behind her ears. She had Robin's straight brown eyebrows, and her eyes were the same deep blue, but soft and gentle where Robin's were quick and hard. You must be Julian, she smiled, as if he'd just given her a bouquet of flowers, then picked up Jojo, who immediately put his thumbs in his mouth and lay his blonde curls against her shoulder. We're so glad to see you. Come in. I just made lemonade. With an enormous sense of relief, Julian followed the woman into a sun filled room with a high ceiling. Sliding glass doors looked out on a shady back deck. A long wooden table was set with a pitcher of lemonade and a plate of chocolate chip cookies. Oops. I'm sorry, the woman said. I didn't even introduce myself. I'm Nancy, Robin's mother. You must be hungry. Can I fix you a sandwich? Sure. I mean, yes, please. Well, I can fix it myself, Julian mumbled. Oh, please, sit down, Nancy said. Now, what would you like? I have chicken or cheese. Julian remembered the chickens running around the yard. Cheese would be great, he said. Nancy sat Jojo down on a stool and gave him a bowl of strawberries and a cup of milk. We've already eaten. Robin didn't tell us that you were coming until lunchtime. She's a procrastinator like me. She layered slices of tomato and cheese on a piece of bread. Now you sit here and eat and tell us all about yourself. Like I told you, Robin jumped in. We both signed up for the Pen Pal program through fun, and we wrote back and forth a little. And I was telling him about where we live, and I was saying how it's so beautiful, and telling him about the Redwoods and about the exchange program. And obviously, he wanted to come, but there wasn't time to do all the paperwork. And, anyways, his mom was out of town. So I told him he could just send the forms and it would be okay if he just came on up. I knew nobody was signed up for June. She looked up at her father. No, she looked up as her father came in the door. I know I should have told you earlier, but I sort of forgot because we've been so busy lately. And he took the bus by himself all the way from San Francisco. Nancy handed him the sandwich. My goodness, your mother couldn't drive you? My mom doesn't have a car, Julian said, swallowing. And also, she's in China. China? Are you Chinese? A lot of times people couldn't figure out what he was. Well, my mom is, but she was born in San Francisco. My grandmother, too. My mom just likes to travel. Who's been taking care of you then? Julian had just taken a huge bite of the sandwich. He chewed slowly while trying to calculate the best response. Well, I was staying with my cousin, but then school got out and Robin said I could come up, so I did. Bob had been watching them with his arms crossed. I don't like it that they cooked up this scheme on their own. At the very least, we should talk to someone in his family. We don't want the police at our door. To Julian's surprise, Nancy just laughed. She had a lovely laugh, like running water. Oh, goodness, she cried. I don't think he's a fugitive, Bob. She adopted a serious expression and turned to Julian. Are you a fugitive? Mom, of course he's not a fugitive. He's just a kid. Are you running away? Are the police after you? Nancy asked. You're a bad guy, Jojo yelled, pointing the spoon at Julian like a spear. Charge. Julian shook his head. There must be someone we can call, your cousin or someone in your family, Nancy asked. I know it sounds a little weird, but my cousin's in Africa on a safari. I guess my whole family likes to travel. Nobody spoke. You could leave my mom a message, Julian said dubiously. Okay, let's start there. Bob reached into his pocket and pulled out the photocopied forms again. There's no home phone listed, he said. Julian hesitated. His mother never checked her voicemail, he assured himself. She wouldn't get Bob's message until she came back from China, and then it would all be over. Besides, if he didn't come up with the number, Bob would probably send him and his duffel bag back to San Francisco on the next Greyhound bus. Julian recited his home number, and Bob dialed and listened intently. Julian heard the tiny echo of his mother's message coming through the phone. Carrie Lee, leave a message if you wish, but I probably won't get back to you for a long time. Peace. Hello, Miss Lee. This is Bob Elder in Wildless, Bob said. Your son Julian is staying with us for a few weeks on our exchange program. I understand you're out of the country, but if you have any questions, give me a call. He left his phone number and hung up. Any other relatives? Bob asked. Julian shook his head. Father deceased. Bob was still studying the forms. 5 years ago. Bob gave a small nod in acknowledgement, and then his face relaxed, so that Julian could see that it wasn't really a mean face. Well, he said to Nancy, I guess we can't just send him away now that you've got him under your wing. Julian couldn't tell if Bob was pleased or not. He thought not. I'll take your bag up to the loft, Bob said. You'll be sleeping up there. Jojo followed his father across the room to a spiral staircase, chanting, I want to sweep in the loft. The kitchen seemed suddenly brighter. The phone message wasn't in the plan, but at least Bob had said he would be staying. Julian was starting to feel better. He finished his sandwich and his lemonade, and Robin's mother passed around the plates of cookies. So you have 5 children, he asked. So far he'd only seen Jojo, and he'd been wondering where the rest of the family was. Yes, I do, Nancy beamed. John and Dave are in college, but they're both doing a service project in Guatemala this summer. Then there's Robin, and next is Molly. She's spending the night with our neighbors. Then Jonah, our baby. A white ball of fluff streaked under the table. This, Nancy said, is Snowball, the newest addition to our family. She picked up the kitten and stroked his fluffy fur. He showed up a few weeks ago, and now we can't seem to get rid of him. The kitten squirmed, and Nancy placed him gently on the floor and started to clear the table. Robin, why don't you show Julian around, she said. I'm sure he's tired of sitting after being on the bus all morning. Julian followed Robin out the sliding glass doors and onto the back deck. He studied the scene, adjusting the image he'd been carrying around of Robin's home. He always had a feeling of dissonance when he came to a new place. It was never like he'd imagined. Sometimes the picture he'd created was more real than the place itself, and the real and imaginary places would coexist in his mind like two separate places. Robin's family was different from how he'd envisioned them, and her house was too. It was not in a sunny field next to a forest, but in a little clearing with the forest all around. The house wasn't a barn red rectangle, but unpainted wood, with different levels of a sloping roof. Of course, the chicken were there, and a lot of other things he'd never thought of. The tire swing, a large picnic table, and a fire ring out back, and behind him a winding creek with a little footbridge. He followed Robin around as she chattered on about the barn where they kept the goats, the greenhouse, the large vegetable garden still covered with plastic, the berry batches. Although Julian decided Huckleberry Ranch was decidedly superior to the house of his imagination. It was probably the most beautiful place he'd ever seen. Where are the redwoods? He asked. after they had toured all the land surrounding the house. Well, we have lots of redwood on our property, but it's all second growth. This land was all logged back in the 1920s. They cut down every single redwood tree, if you could imagine that. When my grandparents bought this place, some of the trees were growing back. They planted thousands and thousands of redwood seedlings and the orchards. How big is this place? 250 acres. Big Tree isn't on our land, of course. It's next door, over this way. Robin ran towards the creek and crossed the footbridge. Julian didn't really know how big 250 acres was, but one of his mom's friends had a house in Marin with an enormous backyard, many times bigger than the tiny space behind his own house. I'm living the American dream, the friend would boast. Quarter acre lot, house in the burbs. If that was a quarter of an acre, 250 acres must be like a giant park or the zoo. Here's one of the apple orchards. Robin pointed to a dozen or so trees standing in a grassy meadow. Sometimes there's deers here. One of the one of the does is tame. You can feed her out of your hand. She loves green apples. Robin was moving quickly through a grassy clearing covered with dandelions. This is where my house is going to be, near the river, so I can generate all my electricity with the water wheel. Is your dad really going to build you a house? Julian asked. Robin looked at him in surprise. Of course he is. Didn't I already tell you that? She turned and disappeared down a slope. Here's the river, she called back. The flow's pretty high now, so don't fall in. Robin ran across a narrow tree trunk, split lengthwise, which formed a bridge across the water. There were no handrails. Julian stepped cautiously along the trunk, his arms extended like a tightrope walker. He tried not to think about the gray boulders and the dark waters rushing below him. When he reached the opposite bank, he realized with embarrassment that Robin was watching him. She took off without saying a word. The path was covered with dead leaves. If it followed the river for a bit, then began to wind up through the forest, back and forth along steep switchbacks. This was certainly not the shady little trail he'd imagined. Hey, he shouted to slow Robin down. We have trees like this in San Francisco. He pointed to a shrubby tree with large pink flowers. He didn't want her to see him out of breath, and he was relieved when she stopped and started pointing. That's a rhododendron. Oh my god, I don't know how to say that at all. I'm just gonna skip it. Maybe you guys can look it up. I'll look it up later too. My mom's favorite. And there's some Douglas fir and some oak, she said, waving vaguely. Big trees only about half mile farther. And with that, Robin was off again, her brown braids flying as the trail snaked up and up. Julian had lost sight of her when he turned a bend and found her lying on the ground, sticking her head under a faucet that came out of the side of the hill. Can you drink that? It's not polluted, Julian said. It's spring water. If we bottled this stuff, we'd probably make a fortune. Try it. Julian hesitated. She made an impatient little noise. You see that black hose? That goes to our house. This water's the same stuff we drink all the time. A faucet coming right out of the ground struck Julian as the strangest thing he'd ever seen on the ranch. Some of the water running into San Francisco Bay was so dirty you weren't even supposed to touch it. Nobody would even think of drinking it. Julian bent down and put his head under the faucet. The water flowed out cool and fresh. It sprang out of some deep, clean place inside the earth and into his mouth. After the spring, the trail started going downhill, but still Julian struggled to keep up. Finally, Robin headed down a small slope and crossed the river again. This time, Julian saw with relief there was a regular bridge made out of wooden planks. Robin waited for him on the far bank. Despite his best efforts, Julian could breathe without panting. Robin spoke almost in a whisper. Here across the river, it's not our land, so technically we're trespassing. This used to be Ed Greenlee's land. He was nice. He would always let me and my brothers play in Big Tree Grove. He did some logging, but it was sustainable. She gave Julian a questioning look. He didn't cut down more than more than could grow each year. Anyway, Dad said Mr. Greenlee would never have logged Big Tree. After he died, his kids started fighting and they ended up selling the land. And then it was bought and sold by different people, but none of them moved in. Finally, your uncle bought it, or IPX did, and they pretty much want to clear cut the whole place. And we're all just sick about it. She looked at him appraisingly. Come on, it's not far now. The trail followed the river, then turned sharply away. Robin scrambled up a small slope and waited until Julian stopped, breathless beside her. This is Big Tree, she said. It was a place left over from another time, from the age of dinosaurs. Giant redwoods soared up to the sky, their tops towering impossibly high above them. On the forest floor, clusters of green ferns were lit up by slanted shafts of sunlight. Huge logs lay sunk into the ground, and green plants and redwood saplings sprouted from their mossy tops. Julian stared. He had not imagined a place so wild, so unhuman in scale, so profoundly silent. He followed Robin inside a circle of trees surrounding a clearing of brown earth. Robin lay down on the ground, flung her arms to the side, and looked up at the sky. This is a fairy ring. Right here used to be a giant redwood. Then, hundreds of years ago, it must have died, and these trees sprung up around it. They're like its children. Julian sat down cross legged inside the fairy ring. So, what happened with your dad? He wasn't quite ready to let Robin off the hook for his ordeal at the bus stop. You said you were going to take care of the paperwork from Fun, and then you changed the whole plan without even telling me? You made me look like a liar. She sat up and put her arms around her knees. I know I'm sorry, but at the last minute I just couldn't do it. Fun's very organized. My dad would have called the central office if the forms came in at the last minute. I thought it would be better to stay a little closer to the truth. Your dad almost sent me back on the bus. It was dicey, she agreed, but I knew once you got to the house it would be okay. So long as my parents don't realize you're Sibley Carter's nephew, it'll be fine. I guess you didn't tell them you sent my uncle that email. Oh, they would have been furious. It's kind of amazing it got there at all. I was just guessing his email address. My brother's taking a journalism course, and he was telling us how a lot of people, even big CEOs, read their own email, and their addresses are just their names and their company web addresses. That gave me the idea. I never really thought he would get it, or you, obviously. But all's well that ends well, as my mom says. She flopped back down. Julian watched her curiously. He had never known a girl who talked so much. In fact, he really didn't know many girls at all. He had no sisters, and neither did Danny. His only cousin was a boy. Even his soccer team was all boys. Of course, there were girls at school, huddling together in the halls, giggling and whispering, but they mostly ignored him. Julian leaned against the rough redwood bark and breathed in the mossy air. The trees in Muir Woods, he thought, were redwoods too, but somehow this place felt entirely different. This forest was not fenced and swept and filled with signs and paths for tourists. It was wild and remote. He and Robin must be the only people around for miles. So, what are you going to do about Big Tree now? He asked. Robin sighed. Nothing, I guess. I mean, my parents filed an appeal, and so did a few environmental groups. They had letters from scientists and everything. But my dad says it's probably a lost cause. But you're going to let them come and destroy all of this? He waved his hand around. Me, them, she said in astonishment. It's your uncle who's in charge. He could stop the logging in a minute. Why don't you go back down to San Francisco and get him to stop? He hadn't expected such an outburst. He was beginning to think that Robin's whole family was a little unpredictable. You always say he's my uncle, like that makes any difference, he said. But he basically hates me. I mean, he was trying to get rid of me for the entire summer. Robin frowned. Then why are you staying with him in the first place? My mom always wanted to go to China, he began slowly. Finally, she got this grant to go there and study the Buddhist temples and photograph them. And she couldn't really take me, and it was too long to stay with Danny or anybody else, so my mom asked Sibley if I could stay with them. Of course, my uncle has a big house, plenty of room. My mom even offered to pay for my food, which was a little crazy because she basically has no money and my uncle's super rich. But he is your uncle. He can't really hate you. No, he does. Julian was silent for a few moments. The night I found your message, I was in Sibley's office. He was at a meeting. And right before your message came in, I found an email from my uncle saying he was sending me to this math camp and all this other bad stuff. What a terrible kid I was, and how I reminded him of my dad. Maybe he hates you because he and your dad were bitter enemies, Robin said in a melodramatic voice. But now he has to pretend they weren't because you can't speak ill of the dead. Maybe. Did they have a fight or something? I don't know. In his memory, his father was always laughing. He remembered holding tight to his father's leather jacket as the wind squeezed his eyes shut. The motorcycle's roar almost drowned out his father's whooping laugh, and his father with his arms around his mother, their laughing faces lit by an enormous bonfire, the wind blowing cold from the ocean. My mom says my dad never wanted to talk about his family. Far away, they heard a bell ringing faintly. That's the dinner bell, Robin said, jumping up. Trust me, you don't want to be late tonight. And she was out of the fairy ring, up the slope, and almost out of sight before Julian even made it to his feet. And that is the end of chapter 9. Good job.